right. So welcome everyone. This is Ramesh Byanas from System Change Alliance, and I'm here with Thomas Rain Crowe, an award-winning author and poet who has written more than 30 books, including several books of translations, and of course including translating Hafez. He has read and performed his Hafez translations at Sufi Conferences, the Meher Baba Center in Myrtle Beach in the United States, and also in joint readings with Coleman Barks. And he's also, who is of course famous for his translations of Rumi. And so Thomas, it's nice to have you here with us. And wanted to begin by maybe talking a little bit about your background. You were part of what they often call the baby beat generation that, came out of the beat generation with people like Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, both very famous poets. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that time of your life and how that led into your own writing and pursuit of becoming a writer and poet.
Okay, I'll try as quick as possible because it's a big story. When I graduated from college, I thought I wanted to be a poet. I knew then I did, but I thought to be a poet, you had to be French. I loved the French poets. I knew the French language from high school and college. So I went to France and tried to be a French poet. But it didn't take me too long to figure out that I was never going to be a French poet or be accepted as a French poet. I would be an American wannabe French poet. And then I was at Mont Saint-Michel, and I was very sick. And I was trying to recover there on Mont Saint-Michel. It was in the wintertime, so there was nobody else there. I was kind of there alone almost, except for the monks. And I had this kind of waking vision of the American continent. And the message that I got from that waking visions up on top of Mont Saint-Michel, looking out toward the ocean, was that my true home was the North American continent. So I honored that vision and came back to the States immediately, and eventually ended up in San Francisco, because San Francisco was where most of my beat literary heroes were residing at that time. And that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to be with those people. I'd never met them. I'd spent a little time with Ginsberg on some anti-Vietnam War protest marches and some things like that, but I'd never really spent real time with any of these people whose work that I really liked. So I went to California, I went to San Francisco. I hooked up with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was the first person that I met and spent time with. And then one thing just happened right after another, and we resurrected Beatitude magazine from the 50s. Bob Kaufman was one of the original editors of that, along with Richard Brautigan. And we started doing poetry readings, protest events, resurrected the old Beatitude magazine, like I said, and really started creating a revival of what had happened in the 50s and 60s with that whole beat generation renaissance. And as a year or two went by, it really escalated into some major readings and major venues, and we put on a major San Francisco Poetry Festival, and the whole thing just spread out over the whole Bay Area. And it became a real literary renaissance. I mean, in a very big scale. It's not something that's been well documented. Had a book a year and a half ago came out called the San Francisco Renaissance, and it documents a lot of that and the players and the people. But during those years, I spent a lot of very intimate quality time with people like Gary Snyder and Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and Diane DePrima and Michael McClure, Bob Kaufman, and then there are many, many more players in that whole beat community. Very lively time, very exciting. I couldn't have been in a better place at a better time. Very lucky. Timing is everything, and I was there at the right time. And I was sitting at the feet of all these people, and it was really my real education as a writer, as a young writer, just being with these people and sharing conversation, ideas, poetry. I could go on and on. This is a long story, like I said, but that was several years during the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, around 1980, I moved back to North Carolina here in the mountains and spent 4 years in the woods trying to live like Thoreau, or actually living more like people who actually did live off the land and off the grid. Thoreau really didn't, but he wrote about it very well. And from there, I eventually ended up at the Meher Baba Center in Myrtle Beach. And that starts the story of our Hafez conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I remember you told me that Gary Snyder was a big influence. And of course, for those who don't know, Gary Snyder is one of the most celebrated poets in America. And he was very much into Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. And he was actually one of the first American poets, him and Robert Bly, that I read. I remember I read his poetry early on, and so he was an influence in my life as well. But so from there, you moved back east, which is, I understand, where you came from, which is where we are now. We both live in North Carolina, in the southeastern United States. And you mentioned the Meher Baba Center. And I'm sure that many are familiar with Meher Baba, but some are not. So I was thinking to open up our conversation about Hafez, to read from your book, Drunk on the Wine of the Beloved, your 100 translations of Hafez, because Meher Baba, who was and he is, of course, a well-known Indian mystic and lived in the United States part of his life. He was very fond of Hafez, as I understand. And in this introduction called Wine and Love, in your book, he explains something very important for us to understand about Hafez. And so I'm going to just read a short passage. He says, "The drunkenness of the drunkard begins with a glass of wine, which elates his spirit and loosens his affections and gives him a new view of life that promises of a forgetfulness from his daily worries. He goes on from a glass to 2 glasses to a bottle, from companionship to isolation, from forgetfulness to oblivion. Oblivion, which in reality is the original state of God." And then he says, "The lover's drunkenness," and here is where Hafez comes in. He's not the drunk in the literally being drunk on wine. "The lover's drunkenness begins with a drop of God's love, which makes him forget the world. The more he drinks, the closer he draws to his beloved, and the more unworthy he feels of the beloved's love, and he longs to sacrifice his very life at the beloved's feet. He too does not know whether he sleeps on a bed or in a gutter and becomes an object of ridicule to the world, but he rests in bliss, and God the beloved takes care of his body, and neither the elements nor disease can touch it." So maybe you can speak to this issue of, Hafez, using this kind of imagery of wine and drunkenness, and in terms of his mystical poetry.
Yeah, probably begin by just mentioning that as a follow-up to what we were talking about in terms of my time in California, but Robert Bly had a big influence on me in terms of his work, his translations of Kabir. And I was the director of the San Francisco Poetry Festival, and I invited Robert to be one of the readers on one of the nights. And he came and read some of his own poetry and from Kabir. And I didn't know Kabir. I didn't know the Sufi poets. And so that was my introduction. And I love Kabir's poetry. So being introduced to the Sufis, I looked more into it, and I got to the Meir Center in Myrtle Beach, hearing about this Meir Baba, who was the avatar of the age, people were saying. So I was curious and went there and spent time in the library there and looked through translations of Hafez that had been done by other people. And in the end, it was the ecstatic poetry of Hafez that I really melded with the most, or was most attracted to. And most of those ecstatic poems had to do with the metaphor of wine. And, you know, at first reading, you're reading that, well, let's just go get drunk on some wine and then let's go find some women and have a good time. I mean, that's really how it reads, but it's not that simple, because all these words, wine, and when he uses she or love imagery, he's not talking about, you know, sexual love, or he's not talking about alcohol. Like it says here in the introduction that I write to the book, it says the metaphor of wine, for instance, while referring principally to divine love, can also mean truth, grace, or knowledge. While the metaphor of the wine glass or cup is a direct reference to the heart. So when Hafez says, "O wine bringer, fill my cup to the brim with your best wine," he's really saying, "Oh God, pour your divine love into my heart." Mm-hmm. And all the poems that I collected and that I eventually ended up translating really are of this nature. Most of them, not all of them, refer to the wine metaphor and to this idea of being drunk on the wine of the beloved, which is the ultimate goal, according to the perfect masters like Meir Baba, that we should be striving for, to be united again with God, or the source, or however you want to refer to him, or her, or it. So that's the journey. Mm-hmm. My journey took me to the Meir Center in the library, and principally to this book. This is a translation, a complete and collected collection of translations of Hafez's poems by English military man stationed in Persia in the 1890s. Well, the end of the century, about 20 or 30 years he was there, named Wilberforce Clark, Lieutenant Colonel Wilberforce Clark. And he's done prose, is kind of prose scholarly translation. He knew Farsi, was fluent in Farsi, so he was a good person to do it. And he was passionate about Hafez for some reason. And we have this huge tome, and this is the main body of work that I worked from in making my, what you would call versions, I guess, since I don't speak Farsi. I kind of translated Clark's literal translations into an English and a poetry that could be understood in a contemporary sense. So that was my work. And what he says about Hafez in his introduction is, he took the name Hafez, which is a word signifying one who knows by heart the Quran. Or also Hafez can mean a caretaker. And about 4 miles from Shiraz, he was from Shiraz in Persia, there was a hill where it said that the idea that a youth who would sleep pass 40 successive nights in this place would infallibly become an excellent poet. So Hafez then, who was a youth, accordingly vowed that he would do this. And he did, and he became an excellent poet, as we all know now. But this fellow, Wilberforce Clark, published his original collection of the collected works of Hafez in 1891. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of the time element. And Hafez, as he became older and was very well known and taught and traveled, his work was written down is that most of his poetry, almost all of it, was all recited. He didn't actually sit down and write out poems like we do today. It was all spontaneous recitations that were written down by his students or his friends and students. And he lived to be about 70 years old. So he had a long life, and he lived during a time that was very, what can I say, kind of a little bit like the times we're living in now. There was a lot of conflict and political and social unrest and all, and he came and went from different places out of necessity just to escape from being incarcerated, because he was not shy about placing the blame where the blame belonged in terms of people who were not following the path of God realization and higher consciousness. And he was persecuted for this. That's a little bit of the background.
Yeah, very interesting. And so as you're mentioning, Hafez was a mystical writer, a writer of spiritual poetry and a Sufi. But as you said, he also commented on politics, the culture and the religion of his time. So what is it that in his message and in his poetry that is relevant to our time? What are some of the themes that is relevant to the times we are going through right now?
Right. I'll just add too, before answering your question, is he's said to have been a Sufi, but in truth, his religion was the love of God and the expression of that love. It says that no spiritual institution could contain him, although his popularity has grown since his death, that even Orthodox Muslims have claimed him as one of their own. So he was kind of outside the box. He, just like Mayor Baba says, it's not about religion and orthodoxy and dogma. It's really about personal growth and through incarnation and into a mystic and God-realized state of consciousness. But to answer your question, yes, a lot of Hafez's work is very blatantly political, and he's not shy about calling people out, like the clergy or politicians or people that are rich that aren't, sharing their fair share with the people who aren't rich, that kind of thing, which is a lot of what we're seeing these days, especially now and especially in this country. We're going through a crisis and a revolution of our own, politically and socially, as we all know. But Hafez speaks directly to this, and one of the poems that does that most directly is a poem that they've titled here in this book, "Drunk on the Wine of the Beloved." It's called "Good News," and I'll just read a little bit of that and to give you an idea. Good news. These hard times won't last forever. Good times and bad times are both the same. Neither lasts. Today I got good news from the world beyond the veil. Gabriel told me that with all the sorrow in the world today, no one will stay. No matter what the future brings, why be happy or sad? For even on the pages of the book of life, the writing will someday fade. This morning, there was more good news, permission to unite with him. The message said, caught in grief's cage, surrender is your reward. Hafez, don't ever stop longing for the wine of the beloved. His goodness will wash all this tyranny and violence away.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So in other words, even though we're going through crisis and you know, whether they're political, financial, economic, environmental, there is the spiritual is always there. And if we cultivate that through spiritual practice and in his way, in this kind of ecstatic poetry, we can be survivors and still enjoy life, even though, you know, at times it is difficult when people are going through hardship, and now as we are going through a kind of planetary crisis, environmental crisis as well. So you know, Hafez he became famous amongst many of the Western writers, even you know, Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of his admirers, and Goethe in Germany, and Lorca in Spain. These you know, great thinkers and poets. So, what is it you think that so in his poetry that feels so important or so essential and deep to people from different cultures, different languages? What is the universal message that people admire so much in Hafez?
Well, Hafez was said to be a perfect master, which means he was God realized. And if that's true, and his poetry certainly gives us a little bit of evidence that it very well could have been, then he knows a whole lot more than we do. And he's able to communicate that knowledge in a poetic way that resonates universally. Like you say, you know, he's admired throughout the world in all countries and all religions, universally, because what he says feels like the truth. It resonates with you and it feels true, even though you might not quite understand what exactly he's trying to say, but you know there's something there that is important, and so you keep going further and further. I know that when I was translating the 2 books that I've done of Hafez's work, you know, it was months and months of work in both cases, and I just got totally immersed. I was, if you want to use one of his metaphors, I was drowning in his love, and want to do anything else. I just, for hours every day, just wanted to be in the presence of this man's beautiful metaphoric mind. And so he has that kind of an effect on people. Well, just let me read one little short thing here to give you an idea. And it's also about the ecstasy. It's the energy. This guy is pouring universal energy into these poems, and you can feel it. And that's what I was trying to do in doing my versions coming out of Wilberforce's kind of scholarly prose-like book, to make it, to find the message and to give it the rhythmic energy that it needs to work. So he says, "Oh, beloved, this is Hafez, and I'm standing at your door. Where else is there for me to go? Where will I go? What will I do? What will I be? What will be my plan? I'm sick of all this sorrow and deceit. I am the king of hearts. Ask anyone. No one has suffered this much pain. Here are Hafez's poems. They are proof of my devotion and my love. I offer them in silence, and they're all I've got to say."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very, very humble, but very very much engaged.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and you know, when you're reading these poems, they remind me, of course, of Kabir, whom I know more than I do Rumi or Hafez. I was also introduced to Kabir through Robert Bly, and then later on through other translations. So the poetry that he was writing in is the ghazal form. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but so what is it? What's the specialty of the ghazal form? Maybe you can share a little bit about that, because the first time I was introduced to it was the songs of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, who sings, you know, these incredible songs, ecstatic songs, and it just captivated me. I didn't understand anything of what he was singing, but just the melodies and the power of this man's singing, just so inspiring. So what is it about the ghazal form? What does that mean in terms of poetry writing?
Right. Well, the ghazal was a poetic form, a style back in the 14th century and beyond. Very formalized poem. It would be, you know, like some of our more modern poetic forms that you know we read and write in these days. But the ghazal form was basically identified by a form of couplets. That's 2 lines rhyming, and the rhymes varied according to what the poet wanted them to do. But it was very, very strict and very, very formal, and that's why it's been so hard for the translators of Hafez's poetry, the ghazal form especially, to really represent the full integrity and the dynamism of his work. Because when you're translating from Farsi into English in a rhyming, strict couplet form, it's very restrictive. I tried to do that in the beginning and I just gave up. In some of the translations that I've seen of people who have tried to do that more literal rhyming from Farsi to English, I think have failed pretty much in the most part. They may have been correct in their wording, but the energy's not there, the rhythm's not there. Hafez isn't there. And that problem initially reading on translations is I couldn't find the Hafez that Mir Baba said was the greatest poet who ever lived, you know, because I had friends that were writing better poetry than Hafez, and that they weren't perfect masters. So let me give you an example. There's a few poems that I've done that I tried to keep in the ghazal tradition. In other words, there's couplets and they're rhyming. And here's one that's titled Learning How to Fly. To the pilgrim, love is the only guide. And while in the beloved's path, many tears I've cried. It's not my fault that I live here in infamy. I was lost in love's road and God was the guide. For years now, I've been thinking about the ghazal, about the elephant driver on the banks of the Nile who said, either understand the ways of an elephant driver or do not go to India dreaming of an elephant ride. Either don't make friends with elephant drivers or begin building a house in which the elephant can reside. So don't invite me to a paradise with no wine and no minstrel. I float better in the wine cup than in the salty sea. Hafez says, find the map of love and become road lost, or without the guide, learn how to fly. Now that's pretty close to the original. You can see how every couplet rhymes. It's a single rhyming scheme of cried, guide, ride, reside. I mean, throughout the whole thing that way. And for the most part, a lot of the ghazal forms, ghazal poems rhyme in that way. There's another example that's a little different. It's the same, but it's done a little differently. The way that the rhyme is, it's a single word used in every stanza throughout the whole poem, and the rhythm is a little different. I'll just read you a few of the couplets to give you an idea. It's a poem called Nothing. The value of all the gold in the world is worthless. Nothing. Wine bringer, bring wine, because this whole world and its business is nothing too. Both heart and soul of Hafez desire the beloved's presence. To him, this is everything, and without that, life and happiness are nothing. Life on this earth is short and is gone like a forgotten dream. Use this time to rest, for even this time does not exist. And friends, don't worry about what people say. Be the happy rose. The power of this passing world is like the breeze, gone, and is nothing. And I say to the professors, be careful, and don't always think you are right. For the distance from the monk's cell to the master's abode is less than you think. See, he gets his dig in there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I say, I have been worn away to nothing from all this grief and suffering. Yet there's no need for me to confess to any priest, for this too is nothing. That's pretty heavy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dame that has the seal of approval, but the wino is not impressed. To have much and to have nothing is the same, and it's nothing.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
I also heard that he made some changes to the ghazal form by including sort of repetitive chants in the poems or in the songs, so that it became sort of more of a meditative experience. Are you familiar with that, or?
I'm not as familiar with those as I am the wine poems and the more. I mean, I know what you're talking about. There are poems that the rhythms lend themselves to chant. I can't right off the top of my head. There's probably some I could find if I took a few minutes that literally have a chant that is repetitive in that way. There's a lot of illusion, repetitive illusion, like the one I just read, throughout a lot of his poems. And he keeps coming back to the metaphors or similar metaphors in the single poem to emphasize, and it's always in a rhythm. There's always a rhythm.
Yeah. So, there seems to be an increasing interest in this kind of poetry today in the West, and I would like your perspective on this, because it seems to me that we in the West, we have gone in a different direction than Eastern countries, in that they emphasize culture, mysticism, and so on, whereas we in the West, we have emphasized the material growth, and so on. And there seems to be a growing thirst in the Western world for this kind of ecstatic experience, whether it's through music or poetry. So do you think that's one of the main reasons why these forms of poetry is becoming more popular today?
I think so. This interest in mysticism now has been apparent now for, I would say 40 years in my own life experience, starting with people like Robert Bly and my connections with him, and Gary Snyder and his Zen practice, and Ginsberg, of course, too. Kerouac even was very much into Eastern mysticism. So, in my background, those are some of my touchstones, but you read on your own, you find other people in other places, and you have other experiences I've had my own ecstatic experiences and where light bulbs went off, and it changed the course of my own particular path and direction. It was usually through some kind of suffering that you go through, and basically, you know, now all of these, they're all saying the same thing. It's all about surrender, and you can't really make the next step on the ladder to higher consciousness unless you surrender, and in surrendering, then doors and windows open to you, and you're able to see more clearly and make the right move toward towards grace and health. And Hafez says in this one poem here, he says at the last line, he's always referring to himself. The last line of the ghazal is a reference to himself. And so he says, Hafez says, "Come out from behind that veil. The only thing standing between yourself and the beloved is you." And, that's a very powerful line. That
yeah. So
almost single-handedly explains the whole process of the road to God realization.
So the beloved here is the divine, is God, or is the beloved the teacher, or who is the beloved here?
Beloved is God.
It's God. Okay.
You know, in whatever form you want to identify with a creator image.
Right. And so now for some people, of course, talking about God in these very intimate forms, some people may not feel drawn to this kind of mysticism, but then nature and the inspiration of nature may be a similar form of longing, you know, and the awe of the mystical in nature is a way for other people, and through music, dance, and so on. We are basically getting out of ourselves, putting the mind away, and getting into the spirit realm. And so, in a sense, when we do that, when we experience that, metaphors are, you know, sort of melts away in a sense. But of course, metaphors are also important in that they can bring us to that and be useful. But metaphors can also be confusing and create conflict. And of course, that's where religious dogmas can also often creep in and create division between people. But it seems like, as you're saying, Hafiz and Rumi and Kabir and Mirabai from India, they were poets and spiritual masters that were talking about a universal experience beyond religious dogmas and beyond religious sectarianism. Does that make sense?
Oh, perfect sense. I'm in the process of listening to a lecture series on the Quran by one of the more formidable scholars of the Quran, and I'm learning a lot. And you know, I've been through phases of trying to understand the Bible and reading and listening to people talk about biblical scripture, and then, you know, through Gary Snyder and other people, I've studied some Zen. But every time I get into these religions, I hit a wall. And I've done that every time. I had a surrender experience during college where I thought I was going to commit suicide after a bad LSD trip that lasted a year.
Wow.
And I surrendered one night thinking, this is it. I can't go anymore. And I didn't believe in God. I was agnostic, a big time Gnostic, or even an atheist, probably in my early 20s. And I surrendered. I said, God, if you're there, if you exist, whatever you are, I need your help. I can't do this anymore. And immediately, the dark cloud that was hanging over me, that was driving me towards suicide, disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about surrender, but then more so, it's all about love, and all the perfect masters and teachers talk about this. The love is the channel to this higher consciousness. And there's lots of ways to approach it. Some are very practical, through dance, through singing, through meditation, through rhythmic work. There's a lot of ways to open the channels for these higher states. And it's, everything is not for everybody. You have to pick and choose yourself, what works, they say whatever works, and everybody's got their own individual path to tread. So,
Yeah.
and some want to go straight. I mean, like Gandhi wanted to go straight to God. He didn't want to fool around with all these, 100 more reincarnations. He hooked up with Meher Baba, and Meher Baba told him, he asked Meher Baba, he said, what can I do to gain God consciousness? And Meher Baba said, give up politics. He couldn't do that. He was too connected to helping his fellow citizens in India. So, it's all relative and it's all personal, and there's a lot of different ways to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which gets us to an important sort of meeting point between spirituality, deeper consciousness, deeper awareness, ethics, and activism. I know that you have been an environmental activist in most of your adult life. And so how has that influenced or informed your activism, your spiritual inclination? Is there a way to, I believe there is, and I feel it in my own life, there is a way to balance the two, that we don't have to necessarily give up activism, but rather we can infuse our activism with a sense of the divine or higher consciousness.
Yes, and again, all the higher spiritual teachers say the same thing. They say service is one of the best things you can do physically and with your life to gain brownie points toward higher consciousness and to open those doors and windows because of the love. I mean, being in service for others, especially those who need help, creates a whole different vibe in your body, chemistry of your body. And when you're doing good deeds for others, not for your own benefit, but unselfishly, then it changes your metabolism and it opens up the brain patterns. I mean, people are studying the brain now, and I'm listening to what they have to say, and they're connecting action with brain activity. And so service and giving in a loving way is very important according to the people who are supposed to know. So
right.
Being an environmental activist is exactly that. It's service not only to humanity, but for all creation and for the whole planet.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds then that perhaps what Meher Baba was indicating was that give up politics in the sense of politics, but not give up your service.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, very, very important distinction. And I think that is exactly what is missing in today's politics and in today's, creating policies on whether it's in economics or in the environment. The fact that there's so much invested in it, either through ego or through vested interest. I'm doing this. Yes, we say that we are, serving the environment and we're becoming. Creating more sustainability and so on, but we're doing it so that we can improve our profit margin. It's not really service, and that is one of the things that is missing today. So Thomas, we have a question here, and the question is from one of our listeners or viewers. What are the challenges of translating Hafez, and what is your approach to bringing the essence of these original poems into English language versions?
What was that last part started.
Well, what is the challenge in translating Hafez? You talked a little bit about that in the beginning, and what has been your approach to bringing the essence of these original poems into English language?
Right. Well, I don't know. I was in a sacred space when I started doing my versions. I was just doing it for fun because I couldn't find any Hafez that I thought was very good or was appropriate in terms of what I'd heard about his work. So I just started doing my own versions to try to plug in to the deeper message and in a language that, wasn't that rhyming couplet. It was couplets, but it was free verse for the most part. But and being in the right place at the right time, and I had some very interesting experiences at the Mayor Center on my first few visits. I won't go into all those details. We don't really have time, but I was of a mind where I was very open, and I was having a lot of fun with this. I thought it was going to be very hard, but it turned out it was very easy, just to have fun. I wasn't trying to be serious, and I didn't have any ideas about publishing anything or any of that. I just wanted to try to create the voice for Hafez that I thought that Mayor Baba talked about and that other people, other great sages from ancient past talked about these Sufi poets. And so I just started playing around with it and having fun. And it was so much fun. And I was going deeper and deeper into this consciousness that I had never experienced before. I was happy. I was understanding that love was a little bit bigger, a bigger idea than just falling in love or physical, sensual love, which had been my only experience with love up until that point. But I was seeing a whole universe expanding and widening as I did these versions. But I just kept doing them and doing them and doing them because I was having so much fun. And finally, I had a book's length worth of these versions, and I sent it to Ibex Press, which is an Iranian book publisher operating out of the United States here in Maryland. And they wanted to do a book, and they did a book of these, original first batch that I worked on. But then I stopped, and a couple of years went by, and I wasn't doing any translations, but I was missing it. And so I went back and to the Wilberforce Clark and started doing some more. And again, I got into this, several months of just having so much fun and being enlightened and taught at the same time. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to do anything else. I was not writing any of my own poems because, when you're translating someone like Hafez, your poetry pales in comparison, and it just doesn't, it's not worth it. You've got the whole 9 yards right there in front of you. And so eventually it became, Drunk on the Wine of the Beloved, and my good friend Kendra Crawford-Burroughs there in Myrtle Beach, who was an acquisitions editor for Shambhala Press, approached me and wanted the book of Hafez poems, and that's how that happened too. So kudos to Kendra, and many thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Good question or not, but that's kind of how my approach was to doing these versions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I that's wonderful. I should mention that of course your book is available, online, Amazon, if you're using that. So again, Drunk on the Wine of the Beloved by Thomas Rain Crowe. If you're looking for the book, yeah, that's wonderful. So we have talked about Hafez now, and then of course Rumi is very, very famous, and of course I had the honor of experiencing you and Coleman Barks reading or the dueling Sufis. You did that here in Nashville, and that was quite an experience because Coleman Barks, of course, is famous for translating Rumi, but he also is familiar with Hafez, and so you were doing, he was doing Rumi and you were doing Hafez, and you were going back and forth. And I remember being in this crowded space, and suddenly lights went off, and I was looking up in the ceiling. I thought, is this some kind of disco place, and because the light starting to shine, sort of bluish, reddish light. And then it turned out that it was the police outside in the road, because there was such a crowd outside trying to get into the place, and that the police had to open the crowd, because the crowd was blocking the road. So that was quite interesting. So again, just illustrating the popularity of these poets in the West and in America, where we live, of course. So what would you say is the difference, if there is any major difference between Hafez and Rumi as far as poets or mystical poets?
Well, because I don't speak Farsi, I would have to know the language to be able to make that kind of a literal comparison. But Hafez mentions Rumi quite often in his own poems. Rumi was the precursor in the Sufi movement in terms of becoming an ecstatic poet or a recognized poet. And Hafez came right on the coattails of Rumi, and then Kabir and Attar was there, and like you say, other poets as well. But Hafez, what was the question? I lost it.
The difference between Hafez and Rumi as far as poetry is.
Well, there's not a lot of difference. There's a little bit of a difference in style from what I read of Coleman's work. He doesn't speak Farsi either. But of his versions, he's worked with some Farsi speakers. But just reading his versions and other versions and other translations of Rumi and what I know of Hafez, they're different. Their voice is a little different. I'd say that Rumi's a little more prosaic, a little bit more preachy, maybe you might say, in a more prosaic form. Just be the strangeness of translation. It may not be that way at all in the original language, but so I don't really think there's that much difference. You're speaking about perfect masters. You're speaking about people who are more or less God realized, and their message is the same. They pretty much speak to it in similar metaphors and images, so I don't think there's a lot of difference. Their names are, their ages are a little different. They came in a little bit of a different succession along the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, but I don't think there's a lot of difference. And Coleman's translation, a lot of it is Coleman. Any translator brings themselves into the work, and my Hafez is Thomas Crowe. There's a lot of Thomas Crowe in my Hafez. So you can find the differences if you wanted to get down and compare line by line or whatever, but there's really not much difference in the content.
Yeah, wonderful. So we have a few minutes left, and as you know, Thomas, this series of interviews with different writers and activists is featured on the platform of Systems Change Alliance, and we think, as System Change Alliance, we think it is important to bring in culture, poetry, music, art into system change, into changing culture and the systems that we so urgently need to change, because we are living in very intense, in many ways, tragic times. So when I say systems change, what does that mean to you as a poet and as an environmental activist?
Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is what all these Sufi poets that we're talking about be taken seriously, and that people begin to understand what their message is and what they're saying, and start to practice that. But without the expansion of the conscious mind and the higher spiritual focus and lifestyle, none of the changes that are happening physically in the world now are going to occur. There has to be a shift in consciousness, and it has, like Thomas Berry said, in the great work, he said there has to be a shift and expansion in the human mind and the human consciousness, so that these changes that are necessary to stop climate change, to stop racism, to stop the political struggles and that we're seeing in this country, people have to become more aware, more enlightened, and these masters. It's like these are like textbooks. If people were to sit down and spend time with them and not be so distracted by all the technology, that's another problem we have. We're spending way too much time with technology, and we're not connected with the natural world, and we're not connected with the spiritual world. And we have to make time for that. And the teachers need to come forward, and there's some teachers emerging now. I'm starting to see people who I would consider teachers that can help, in smaller communities and in more focus in different areas to make these things happen. I think we're in a critical time when the feminine needs to rise and become dominant in our culture and on the planet. And this is talked about a lot too by the spiritual teachers. But in the end, the bottom line is love. People are going to have to connect with the love energy, and so I'm going. If I may be so indulgent, I'm going to leave. I see we're running out of time, and I'm going to leave my part of this in terms of the poetry with one of my own poems that is really a result of my working with Hafez and his spiritual guzzles. This is not a guzzle. It's a free verse poem. It's called The Perfect Work. And we're talking about work now. What do we do as an environmentalist or as a politician, or it's the perfect work. Love is the perfect work. Music that rings all the bells in the temple. A special wind in the trees. Listen to the way the drummer hits lovingly his drum, the way the dancer moves over the warm earth, and watch as children leave their bodies behind on the old logs around the fire and sing. The world is aglow in the shadows of the children singing, the sticks against wood, of the heavy silent breathing of the old ones who sit off to the sides of the circle and pray. When I am at work in my garden, I take off my shoes. I let my other hands embrace dirt. I plant myself in this place. And knowing what love is, I awake in this place in my body, full of dream music, full of life.
Wonderful, wonderful poem. And I think a wonderful way to end this session. It's been such a pleasure being with you today, Thomas, and talking about Hafez and the importance of change of consciousness. I couldn't agree more. I think that this is really key to lasting change, that we have to, as a humanity, we have to change our consciousness, and we have to open ourselves up to this greater love of humanity and of the environment, and infusing that into our service to the world, through our economic systems and through our political system as well.
Yeah, I don't think that we have to be so depressed about what's going on. It's very easy to get sad and depressed during this time, especially with the pandemic. But I think there's a different way to look at this, and we can look at it as a huge opportunity. And it really is. I think we're being gifted with all this adversity because it comes with the possibility of a greater opportunity for raising our consciousness and our behavior and tapping into that love energy.
Yeah. Wonderful way to end the interview. Thank you so much for being here with me, and maybe sometime in the future we'll have you back. And in the meantime, let's go out and read and study the ecstatic poetry of Hafez and fuse that into our service to the world.
Well, thank you for your invitation, and thank you
Sure.
everyone
You're
who's
welcome.
taken part.